Hey guys, tonight we begin in the smoke-filled courtyards and rice paddies of ancient China, a civilization that gave the world paper, gunpowder, silk, and the compass. But for the ordinary person living inside it, day-to-day life was a completely different story than the one told in emperors' portraits and dynasty scrolls. Forget the flowing silk robes and peaceful pagodas you're picturing. For most people, ancient China was mud, taxes, and the constant threat of a magistrate deciding your fate on a whim. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a farming village somewhere along the Yellow River, roughly 2,000 years ago. The good news, you're alive, and your house hasn't washed away in this year's flooding yet. The bad news, you're about to spend the next 16 hours doing backbreaking labor for a landlord you've never met and a government official who thinks your entire village exists purely to fund his next banquet. Your home is a simple structure of packed earth walls and a thatched roof. 1 or 2 rooms at most, shared with your parents, your spouse, your children, and depending on the season, several sacks of grain you're desperately trying to keep dry. There's no glass in the windows, just paper screens that let in a thin gray light and absolutely no protection from a cold. Heating comes from a small clay stove that also happens to be where all your cooking gets done, so your entire home smells permanently of smoke, millet, and whatever vegetable scraps went into last night's soup. You wake before dawn, not because you want to, but because the rooster outside doesn't care about your feelings, and because the moment sunlight actually breaks over the horizon, you're expected to already be in the fields. Getting dressed is not complicated. You own 1, maybe 2 sets of clothing, coarse hemp or ramie fabric that scratches against your skin and never quite feels clean no matter how many times it's washed in the river. Silk, the fabric ancient China is famous for, is not for you. Silk is for nobles, officials, and the wealthy merchants who somehow always find loopholes around the laws designed to keep merchants poor and humble. You've seen silk exactly twice in your life, once on a passing official's robe, and once wrapped around the body of a wealthy family's deceased grandmother during a funeral procession. Neither occasion left you feeling particularly hopeful about ever wearing it yourself. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a bowl of watery millet or rice porridge, maybe with a few pickled vegetables if the harvest was decent this year. Meat is a luxury reserved for festivals, ancestor worship days, or the rare occasion when your family manages to trap something in the woods without a game warden noticing. Tea exists, and you drink it, but not the delicate ceremonial tea you're picturing from later dynasties. This is a rough, bitter brew, sometimes mixed with ground grain, just to make it filling enough to count as part of a meal. You eat quickly, standing near the stove, because the fields don't wait, and neither does your landlord's steward, who has an almost supernatural ability to appear at your door the exact moment you're running late. Now that you've eaten, or at least gone through the motions of eating, it's time to work. And work in ancient China means the fields, always the fields. Most of the population, somewhere around 80 to 90%, depending on the dynasty and region, are peasant farmers, and your entire existence revolves around the agricultural calendar the way modern people revolve around a work schedule. Except there's no such thing as calling in sick, and there's absolutely no such thing as a day off during planting or harvest season. You spend your mornings ankle-deep in irrigation water, transplanting rice seedlings one by one into flooded paddies, bent double for hours at a time, until your spine feels like it's been replaced with a rusted farm tool. If you're growing wheat or millet instead of rice, congratulations, your back pain comes from a slightly different repetitive motion, but the exhaustion is identical. The tools you're working with are almost embarrassingly simple by later standards. Wooden plows tipped with iron if your family is doing reasonably well, or just fire-hardened wood if you're not. Hoes, sickles, and baskets you wove yourself during whatever spare hours exist between backbreaking labor and collapsing into sleep. Oxen or water buffalo help pull the heavier equipment if your family is fortunate enough to own one, which many families are not. meaning the alternative is you and your relatives providing the pulling power yourselves, which is exactly as miserable as it sounds. Irrigation systems, terracing, and crop rotation techniques developed over centuries make Chinese agriculture remarkably sophisticated for its time. But sophisticated doesn't mean easy. It just means the misery is organized efficiently. And here's the part that makes the whole system particularly cruel. Whatever you manage to grow doesn't entirely belong to you. Depending on the era, you owe a portion to your landlord as rent, a portion to the state as tax, sometimes paid in grain, sometimes in cloth, sometimes in actual days of unpaid labor called corvée service, where the government simply requisitions your body for building canals, roads, city walls, or the emperor's latest vanity project, regardless of whether your own crops are rotting in the field because nobody's home to harvest them. Refusing this labor obligation isn't really an option. Local officials have the authority to punish resistance with beatings, fines, or worse. And there's no appeals process for a farmer whose voice carries roughly the same weight as the mud on his sandals. If you're picturing peaceful rural life with cherry blossoms and gentle rivers, let's talk about what actually happens when the Yellow River, poetically nicknamed China Sorrow by people who clearly had a sense of dark humor, decides to flood. Because it floods often, catastrophically, and with almost no warning system beyond word of mouth, traveling slightly faster than the water itself. An entire harvest, an entire home, sometimes an entire village, can disappear in a matter of hours. Famine follows flooding the way vultures follow armies. And when the crops fail, the government's response depends entirely on which dynasty happens to be in charge and how competent or corrupt the local officials are that particular decade. Sometimes there's grain relief from state storehouses. Often there isn't, and families are left boiling tree bark and grass to survive until the next planting season, assuming they're the next planting season for everyone in the household. Now that your body has been thoroughly punished by a full morning of agricultural labor, let's talk about something equally punishing, taxes, because in ancient China, the government has found extraordinarily creative ways to make sure you never quite get ahead. Taxation isn't just about money, which is good, because most peasants barely handle coin currency at all in their daily lives. Instead, taxes come in several unpleasant flavors: grain taxes, where a percentage of your harvest is handed over regardless of whether that harvest was good or catastrophic; cloth taxes, where your household is expected to produce a certain quota of woven textile, usually hemp or occasionally silk if your region supports silkworms; and the previously mentioned labor taxes, where your actual physical body becomes state property for weeks or months at a time. The household registration system, which various dynasties refined into something resembling a surveillance network centuries before anyone had the technology to call it that, means the government knows exactly how many people live in your home, how much land you farm, and therefore exactly how much they can extract from you. Trying to hide family members to reduce your tax burden is a crime, and getting caught means punishment that makes the original tax bill look like a bargain. Local officials, the magistrates who administer all of this, are appointed by the central government and rotated periodically specifically so they don't build up too much local loyalty or too many local grudges. But this system also means the official currently squeezing taxes out of your village has zero long-term investment in whether your village survives the process. If you happen to be one of the small percentage of people not farming, you might be a craftsman, a potter, a blacksmith, a weaver, and your life involve a different set of miseries. Craftsmen are organized in many periods into hereditary occupational categories, meaning if your father was a blacksmith, congratulations, you're probably going to be a blacksmith too, whether you have any interest in metalwork or not. The state frequently conscripts skilled artisans for massive government projects: palace construction, tomb construction for deceased emperors, which is exactly as unpleasant as building your own eventual burial site sounds, or producing weapons and equipment for whatever military campaign is currently underway. Merchants, despite what you might assume about commercial success, occupy a strange and often looked down upon position in the social hierarchy. Confucian philosophy, which shapes an enormous amount of Chinese social structure, ranks scholars and officials at the top, followed by farmers, whose labor is seen as honorable and essential, then craftsmen, and merchants dead last, viewed with suspicion as people who profit from moving goods around rather than producing anything themselves. A wealthy merchant might have more coins than an impoverished scholar, but the scholar still gets more respect at the dinner table, which must be an infuriating kind of consolation prize. Now let's talk about the home you return to after this exhausting day, because domestic life in ancient China comes with its own rigid set of expectations, and if you're a woman, those expectations are considerably harsher. Confucian social structure places enormous emphasis on filial piety, respect for elders, and a strict hierarchy within the household that governs literally everything, from who eats first to who has any say in major family decisions, which is almost never the youngest generation and almost never women. If you're a woman in ancient China, your life follows a predetermined path with startlingly little room for deviation: obedience to your father as a child, obedience to your husband as a wife, obedience to your son if you're widowed and he's now the head of household. Marriages are arranged, often when you're still a teenager, negotiated between families more like a business merger than anything resembling romance, and your personal preferences factor into the decision approximately not at all. Foot binding, though not universal across all classes and time periods, becomes increasingly common among certain social groups, starting young girls on a process of breaking and binding their feet into a smaller shape considered aesthetically desirable and a marker of status, a practice that causes lifelong pain and disability in exchange for meeting a beauty standard set entirely by people who will never personally experience the consequences. If you're a peasant woman, you might escape this particular practice simply because your family needs you physically capable of hard labor, which tells you something uncomfortable about whose bodies get modified for beauty and whose get left alone for utility. Either way, your days involve spinning thread, weaving cloth, preparing food, raising children, and providing physical labor in the field alongside everyone else, all while receiving a fraction of the social recognition and none of the formal authority given to the men in your household. Children, meanwhile, start contributing to household labor astonishingly early, gathering firewood, tending smaller livestock, watching younger siblings by the time they're old enough to walk steadily and follow basic instructions. Formal education, the kind that leads to literacy and potentially a government position through the Imperial examination system, is a privilege reserved almost entirely for boys from families wealthy enough to afford tutors or, in later periods, village schools, and even then it demands years of memorizing classical texts with a level of intensity that would make modern students weep. For most children, education means learning to farm, weave, cook, and survive, taught by watching parents do the exact same exhausting tasks they'll be doing for the rest of their own lives. Let's talk about what happens when you get sick, because in ancient China, medicine occupies a fascinating position somewhere between genuine sophisticated knowledge and practices that would make a modern doctor wince. Traditional Chinese medicine, developed over centuries, includes acupuncture, herbal remedies, and a theoretical framework built around balancing yin and yang and the flow of qi, or vital energy, through pathways in the body. Some of this actually works, or at least provides real relief. Herbal treatments for various ailments have genuine pharmacological effects, and the theoretical sophistication of frameworks like the Huangdi Neijing, one of the foundational medical texts, represents serious intellectual effort to systematically understand the human body centuries before Western medicine developed comparable frameworks. That said, if you're a peasant, your actual access to trained physicians is minimal. Skilled doctors, the kind who've studied classical medical texts and apprenticed under established practitioners, tend to serve wealthy families and officials who can afford their fees. You, meanwhile, are relying on a village herbalist, a local shaman-adjacent healer, who combines genuine herbal knowledge with rituals meant to appease spirits or ancestors believed to be causing your illness, or simply the accumulated folk wisdom passed down through generations of your own family. Epidemic disease, when it arrives, spreads through villages with brutal efficiency, and infant mortality rates are staggering by modern standards, with a significant percentage of children not surviving past their first few years, a grief so common that it shapes entire cultural practices around not naming children too formally too early, as though delaying attachment might soften an all too frequent loss. Now, if farming, taxes, and disease weren't enough to occupy your worry, let's discuss the ever-present possibility of war. Because ancient China's history is punctuated by dynastic transitions, invasions, rebellions, and civil wars with a regularity that makes peaceful eras feel like the exception rather than the rule. If you're a peasant man of a certain age during the wrong decade, military conscription can pull you directly out of your fields and into an army marching toward a border conflict or a rebellion you have absolutely no personal stake in. The Great Wall, that monumental structure stretching across northern China, wasn't built by cheerful volunteers. Its construction, particularly during periods of large-scale expansion like under the Qin Dynasty, involved forced labor on a staggering scale, with workers dying from exhaustion, accidents, and brutal conditions, their bodies in some cases reportedly buried within the structure itself. A detail that transforms an engineering marvel into something considerably more haunting once you understand the human cost behind it. Bandits and roving armies during periods of instability pose a constant threat to rural villages, and local self-defense sometimes falls to the villagers themselves since government protection, especially in remote areas, is inconsistent at best. Natural disasters compound with political instability in a particularly cruel feedback loop. Famine breeds desperation. Desperation breeds rebellion. Rebellion breeds military crackdown, and the peasants caught in the middle of this cycle rarely benefit from whichever side eventually wins. Dynasties rise and fall roughly according to a pattern historians later called the dynastic cycle. A new dynasty establishes order and prosperity. Corruption and inefficiency gradually set in over generations. Natural disasters and popular uprisings weaken central authority, and eventually a new dynasty emerges from the chaos to begin the cycle again, which is a fascinating historical framework to study in a classroom and an absolutely exhausting reality to actually live through as an ordinary person with no control over any of it. Let's talk about something slightly less grim, food, because despite all the hardship, ancient Chinese cuisine develops remarkable sophistication over the centuries, even if your personal daily experience of it is considerably less exciting than what wealthy households enjoy. Rice dominates in southern regions where the climate supports paddy farming, while wheat, millet, and sorghum are staples further north where conditions favor different crops. Soybeans, incredibly versatile, get transformed into tofu, soy sauce, and fermented products that add flavor to otherwise fairly plain staple grains. Vegetables like cabbage, radishes, and various greens supplement your diet, depending on season, alongside pickled and fermented preparations that help preserve food through winter months when fresh produce simply doesn't exist. Meat, as mentioned earlier, is rare for peasant households, though pork becomes increasingly significant in Chinese cuisine over time for households that can afford to raise pigs, which conveniently eat scraps and require relatively little dedicated grazing land compared to cattle. Chopsticks, already established as the primary eating utensil by this point in history, are typically simple wood or bamboo for peasant households, reserved elaborate lacquered or silver versions for the wealthy. Tea, mentioned earlier as part of your rough morning routine, gradually develops into an entire cultural practice with its own rituals, though the elaborate tea ceremonies you might be picturing develop more fully in later dynasties and remain, for most of history, a pursuit of the educated and wealthy rather than the exhausted farmer just trying to get through his bitter morning brew before the fields demand his attention again. Now let's discuss something that touches literally every aspect of ancient Chinese life, whether you're wealthy or desperately poor, religion and ancestor worship, because your spiritual world is dense with obligations that exist alongside, and sometimes in tension with, your very physical daily survival. Ancestor veneration forms an absolutely central pillar of belief and practice. The idea that your deceased relatives continue to exist in some form and require ongoing respect, offerings, and ritual attention from living descendants, and that neglecting these obligations can bring genuine misfortune upon your household. This isn't a once-a-year formality. It shapes daily behavior, household shrines, dietary offerings, and major life decisions, including, significantly, the intense cultural pressure to produce male heirs who can continue performing these ancestral rites after you yourself become an ancestor requiring veneration. Confucianism, Taoism, and eventually Buddhism, which arrives via trade routes from India and gradually integrates into Chinese religious life, coexist in a way that might seem contradictory to outside observers but functions, for most ordinary people, as a practical toolkit rather than a single exclusive belief system. Confucian principles govern your social relationships and obligations. Taoist concepts inform ideas about balance, nature, and sometimes folk medicine and mysticism, and Buddhist beliefs about karma, rebirth, and the possibility of achieving enlightenment or a better next life offer comfort in the face of the sheer unfairness and hardship of your current one. Local folk religion adds yet another layer, with village deities, nature spirits, and protective rituals that vary significantly from region to region, meaning your specific spiritual practices might look quite different depending on which corner of this vast empire you happen to call home. Festivals punctuate the agricultural and lunar calendar with occasions that provide rare, genuinely welcome breaks from the relentless grind of daily labor. The Lunar New Year involves family reunions, ancestor worship, and for a few precious days, a partial suspension of the endless field labor that otherwise defines your existence. The Mid-Autumn Festival celebrates the harvest moon, with mooncakes if your household can afford the ingredients. And various other festivals throughout the year mark planting seasons, honor specific deities, or commemorate historical or mythological events, giving your calendar year some rhythm beyond simply exhaustion followed by more exhaustion. Let's turn now to something that offers a genuine, if narrow, path toward changing your circumstances, the Imperial examination system, because this institution, refined over centuries, represents one of history's more remarkable attempts at meritocracy, even while remaining deeply constrained by the practical realities of who could actually access the education needed to succeed within it. The theory is elegant. Any man, regardless of family background, can study classical texts, sit for a series of increasingly difficult examinations, and earn a position in the imperial bureaucracy based purely on demonstrated knowledge and skill rather than inherited noble status. The reality for a peasant family scraping by on subsistence farming is that the years of intensive classical education required to have any realistic chance of passing these examinations are essentially unaffordable, both in terms of tutoring costs and in terms of the lost labor of son who could otherwise be working the fields. Wealthy families, naturally, dominate examination success, hiring tutors, providing their sons with the leisure time necessary for years of memorization and essay practice, and building networks that help smooth the path toward eventual official appointment. That said, the system isn't entirely closed. Occasional villages pool resources to educate a particularly promising boy, hoping his eventual success might benefit the entire community, and stories of poor scholars achieving prestigious positions through sheer determination become powerful cultural narratives precisely because they represent genuine, if statistically rare, possibility. For the overwhelming majority of peasants, though, this path remains theoretical, a story told about someone else's cousin's remarkable son, rather than a realistic option for your own household's next generation. As your day finally winds toward its end, let's talk about what actually happens once the sun goes down, because without electric lighting, your evening options are considerably more limited than you might expect. Oil lamps, burning vegetable or animal fat, provide dim, smoky illumination, expensive enough that peasant households use them sparingly, meaning once genuine darkness falls, most people are simply going to sleep, their bodies naturally sinking to daylight hours out of pure practical necessity rather than any particular love of early bedtimes. Your sleeping arrangements involve simple wooden platform beds, sometimes heated from below in northern regions through a system called the com, essentially a brick platform with space underneath for a fire, ingeniously turning your bed into your primary source of warmth during brutal northern winters where outdoor temperatures can be genuinely dangerous. Your family sleeps together, often multiple generations in a single room, privacy being a concept that simply doesn't factor into housing arrangements the way it might in your imagination of individual bedrooms and personal space. Before actually sleeping, evenings might involve simple storytelling, older family members passing down folk tales, family history, or moral lessons framed as entertaining narratives, a form of education and cultural transmission happening entirely outside any formal schooling system, teaching children the values, history, and practical wisdom they'll need to survive their own eventual adult lives running this exact same exhausting cycle you've just spent an entire day living through. So how's your day been? You've woken before dawn to a bowl of watery porridge, spent hours bent double in flooded rice paddies or dry wheat fields, handed over a portion of your harvest to a landlord and a portion to a tax collector who couldn't care less whether you have enough left to actually feed your family, worried about flooding, famine, disease, and the possibility that this might be the decade some rebellion or invasion sweeps through your region and conscripts you or your sons into a war fought entirely for reasons above your understanding and completely outside your control. And now you're settling onto a heated brick platform to sleep before doing this entire cycle again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your life, exactly as your parents did before you, and exactly as your children almost certainly will after you're gone. And yet, through all of this, ancient China produced staggering achievements, papermaking that would eventually transform human communication worldwide, gunpowder that would reshape warfare across the entire globe, sophisticated bureaucratic systems that influenced governance for centuries, poetry and philosophy that remain studied and beloved today, silk production techniques, so valuable they were, for a time, considered state secrets worth protecting with the threat of execution. None of these monumental achievements came from the emperors alone, sitting in their palaces. They came from the accumulated labor, ingenuity, and quiet endurance of millions of ordinary people whose names history never bothered to record, farmers who perfected irrigation techniques passed down through generations, craftsmen who refined their trades through decades of practice, women who kept households and traditions alive through famine and war, and children who grew up absorbing lessons about resilience simply by watching their parents survive one impossibly difficult day after another. So tonight, as you slip into your own bed with electric heating, indoor plumbing, and food that didn't require you to personally negotiate with a flood-prone river god, maybe spare a thought for the ordinary people of ancient China, the ones history remembers only in aggregate, in tax records and population counts, but whose accumulated labor and quiet persistence built the foundation of one of the most influential civilizations the world has ever